All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad you're able to join us for this webinar. My name is Dr. Stephanie Hurder. I am one of the founding economists at Prysm Group, which is a firm focused on the economics of emerging technologies. And today I'm going to be joined by two esteemed panelists who will introduce themselves. Mark.
Thank you very much. So I'm a senior counsel at DLA Piper in their Silicon Valley office. DLA Piper is a global law firm with offices in 40 countries and 4,200 lawyers. I'm one of the co-chairs of our blockchain digital assets practice, and I've been working, in Silicon Valley now for over 35 years. And I'm really excited about the opportunities presented by Web3, and it's great to be working with Stephanie on this. Stephanie and Prysm Group, I think, are the top economists in helping design these new ecosystems, which is, frankly, we're going to see entirely new industries built on this technology, and we need to get the economics straight. So, all
right, thanks very much. And Joshua.
Yeah, I'm Joshua Gans. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto. I'm also a senior consultant to Charles River Associates, and I'm also the stream lead for the Creative Destruction Lab blockchain stream, which looks at hundreds of blockchain startups over the last few years and helps them and mentors them. And finally, I have a book, The Economics of Blockchain Consensus, that's coming out later this year.
All right, excellent. So we are together for an hour. We'll start with a discussion focused around several questions, and we should have a few minutes at the end for Q&A. We received some questions, and also feel free to share them in the chat. All right, so we're going to spend the bulk of the time talking about digital assets, but first I want to step back and talk a little bit about Web3. And one of the questions we get all the time is, how do you define Web3? What is it? Josh, how do you define Web3?
I think the easiest and sort of clearest definition is that it's 50% more web than Web 2. Okay. It's hard to know. A lot of people use Web3 to talk about a lot of things. I think the most interesting parts of that are situations where you're using the granting of rights for governance, such as voting rights and other things that might dictate how some assets controlled by some entity get deployed. And the Web3 aspect of it is that the fact that that entire entity is run virtually.
All right. Mark, how do you define Web3?
Well, as Josh says, it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder, but I think for me, Web3, obviously 3 means it's the third generation of the World Wide Web. But I think some of the characteristics of Web3 are decentralized control, control of your, as an individual, control of your information, and even rights in NFTs and things like that. And it's built on top of blockchain. But I think we're going to see this definition evolve over time. And, there's, a lot of hype around Web3. And I think you just need to be realistic about what's achievable. So,
got it. No, I agree. It's very much sort of what people want to think it is. And in terms of digital assets, Mark, you mentioned, building on blockchain technology. One of the things that's amazing is it seems like every 3 months or every 6 months, there's an entirely new kind of digital asset that's been invented that people want to understand the economics for. How would you categorize digital assets? I realize it's a very, very large space. You can, as I said before, one of the things that I like about the intersection of economics and law with respect to digital assets is you get to use the word property rights a lot. Digital assets are about property rights. Mark, how do you think about different categories of digital assets? How do you think about sort of how to group them?
Well, thanks very much. I think, there are a lot of different digital assets. And I think it's important to have a framework to think about them. I think about them as in a couple of buckets. Bucket number one is primarily financial assets. So things in DeFi, Uniswap, SushiSwap, and also the stable coins. That's sort of that bucket. Second bucket would be what I call the creator economy. A lot of non-fungible tokens are sort of the core element there. And that is the ability to develop creative communities using non-fungible tokens, or even new types of assets like PFP pictures for Bored Ape Yacht Club, one of which was sold for $1 million. But I think the really interesting part there is the ability to self-organize communities. And then I guess the third bucket would be sort of more utility-oriented digital assets. So, for example, Starbucks' use of NFTs for their loyalty program, or using NFTs to track goods. So, one of the problems in supply chains is the good that you have, or the component that you have, really an actual component, or is it a counterfeit? And one of the things you learn that you probably don't want to know is there's a very active market for counterfeits in airplane parts. And as somebody who flies a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people on the call fly a lot too, that's probably not something you really wanted to know. So what NFTs and blockchain technology, sometimes with NFTs, sometimes without, offers the opportunity to track those parts at a very granular level at a cost that's really affordable. And for example, Honeywell now, for certain of its components, actually appends a QR code to it, which is attached to an NFT, so you can track the history of that particular component from the day it was manufactured.
Josh, do you follow a similar categorization? How do you think about the different types of property rights that digital assets can bestow?
Well, I think digital assets aren't new. Is the first thing. In the last 2 decades, we've had a lot of discussion about, for instance, music, MP3 or other or related files, and how they are, what property rights we assign to them. And obviously the regime we ended up using was copyright, and said the problem is if you take these files and make copies of them, and who has the right to do that. What's interesting about this new wave of digital assets is that it isn't relying on copyright law per se. Instead, it is relying on something closer to the property rights we consider for physical assets. Because if, say, for instance, you acquired a non-fungible token and you had to be in possession of that to play a particular piece of music, you could, with that non-fungible token, you could give that to someone else, lend it to someone else, all sorts of things, so that they could play the music, or you could sell it to someone else, much as you would do with a cassette tape or a CD. So in that sense, those digital assets are looking like less about using copyright law, which is a thing we invented in order to deal with the fact that these weren't like physical assets, and more like physical asset law, in which case non-fungible tokens, if they're stolen from you, they're stolen from you. And that is a cost, but it also gives you the right to exchange them and other things like that. But doesn't enable you to copy them, because it has technologies in place to prevent that.
I think Josh's point is a good one, which is that these digital assets provide a new business model, which obviously needs to be properly designed. Cue the Prysm group. But I think, but I would say that copyright will continue to play a very important role in this. But to Joshua's point, where I think one of the most interesting experiments we're seeing is NFT projects like Moonbirds giving up their copyright, saying, we're going to put this in the public domain. So the only thing that is left here from a property point of view is the NFT, which is linked to this image, but anybody can use the image. So that's an experiment. I have to admit a bit of skepticism about it, but I do think that that copyright will continue to play a very important role in many of the digital asset ecosystems we're talking about. So.
Interesting. All right, so let's keep going with NFTs. They've been in the news quite a bit, especially with respect to legal issues. For example, the Hermes Birkin lawsuit was decided this week. So one question we get all the time, I'll turn to you, Josh. How do we think about the fundamental economic value of an NFT? Does it have any value? How do we decide?
Well, I'm sort of in the camp, and I was, when this all arose a year or so ago. There was the NFT craze, which has thankfully ended. That it all, in that first round of it was all pretty stupid. It's not clear that anything like that could have value in of itself. So in the case of the Hermes situation, where, for a brief period of time, a doctored picture of an Hermes bag sold for more than an Hermes bag, according to the NFT that was attached to that picture, we don't have as much coming that way anymore. So it's best to sort of set that aside as a footnote in history. The main use value, therefore, again, I have to think about what it is physically doing. I find that still the most useful. For instance, an NFT is a good way of distributing tickets for events and things like that. An NFT could be a good way of distributing vaccine records. It could be a good way of distributing, for instance, a degree. You get a degree, and what you get really transferred to you is an NFT, and when you use that, people can therefore verify that you are the holder of the NFT with that degree, or that it links up to some other form of digital identification to do with you. So the way I therefore see it is that, taking that technology seriously, we have to ask ourselves what the value is of holding a digital asset, and what permissions it can allow to give. In other words, it's not going to be, if you hold, if your NFT gives you the right to a digital asset that is sitting on a website that anyone can access. Well, we know from the right-click problem that everybody can sort of get the value, a seeming value of that, except for the bragging rights that you happen to have the NFT that is associated with that. Now, bragging rights also are valuable, but that's not really what we're trying to develop the entire ecosystem for. Instead, we want the NFT to be the fundamental basis for a set of rights that are enacted in code that allow you to do things. It might be entry to something, it might be a vote, it could be anything else that we could dream of.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think there will be value in certain of the projects, but like CryptoPunks and Bay Area Yacht Club. But I also agree with Joshua that if your idea is you're going to launch a new 10,000 unit PFP project, good luck to you, because I think that business model is done. I think the interesting part, though, is to use these digital assets to create communities. And so Jenkins of LA is an example. Yuga Labs is another example. So it can dramatically decrease the cost of managing a community, and and enable collaboration, which I think is going to be very interesting. So I've got a client, for example, who's using NFTs to have a community to create a horror film. Turns out the horror films are actually relatively inexpensive to make, and their idea is they want to have input from the community, which will mean that they have an automatic audience. So instead of somebody in Hollywood saying, yeah, my gut says that the people want, you have a situation where you actually have a creative community that can say, yeah, this is what we want. So you already have a community when the film is released.
Got it. So to build on that, when we think about the fundamental value of the rights that a digital asset bestows, I think we can all, think about, okay, this gives you access to a vaccine. This is a ticket. This is a degree. But a number of digital assets are used for governance, for collective decision-making. So how do you think about does that bestow fundamental value? How do you think about the situations where governance rights give fundamental value to a digital asset?
I think it definitely does. It depends on the community, and it also depends on, what rights you have. I mean, and this is still early days. And, there's a lot of discussion of decentralization as being a core value of, Web3, yet we're seeing that, many of the major systems like Uniswap are not that decentralized. There's a big fight going on in voting right now over certain issues, and you have large venture funds voting their governance tokens, in a way that some of the smaller, holders say that isn't right, but that's the way it was set up. So I think so I think we're very much in learning mode on governance. There's a lot that we can learn from the history of the corporation. Remember, the corporation is relatively new. The corporations we know is only about 200 years old, but there's, I think, not enough attention to the sort of the economics of governance, to put it bluntly, because if you're a whale, your economic incentives are going to be quite different from a small holder, and people have not thought that through. But there are ways of dealing with that, like quadratic voting and putting caps on the number of votes you can have, even if you have more tokens. But people have been, I think, a little bit naive about the one token, one vote approach. And I think we're going to see that change over time as people recognize that there are problems with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as we frequently talk about governance design and, the fundamental questions of, what do you have decision-making rights over? What are the assets or processes that you get to vote about, and how do you enforce the decisions? And I think these are a lot of things that, they may seem relatively less exciting than the issuance of a digital asset, but they're extremely important to actually, giving value to the digital assets that are issued. Mark, you brought up the history of the corporation. And this leads us to one of the great analogies that I've seen in this space. So you have this analogy of NFTs as a legal platypus. I was wondering if you could say more about that.
Sure, and I think we have a slide, if we could bring the slide up so people can see it. Okay, so on your lower right of the slide is a platypus. For those of you who are not familiar with the platypus, it is a mammal. It's the only one of the very few egg-laying mammals. It's duck-billed, beaver-tailed, otter-footed, and has a poison spur. And I make the analogy to various legal regimes that cover NFTs, and there's a bunch of them, as you can see. Copyright, trademark, the Uniform Commercial Code, Article 2, and the new Article 12, and then licensing, and of course, securities law, which is the poison spur, because if it turns out that your NFT project is a security, you're going to be under a very comprehensive regulatory regime, which is going to make it very difficult for you to operate effectively. But, I think we're just beginning to see some of these issues to be determined. Stephanie mentioned the Hermes case. That may have an effect on another major case, which is going forward, the Yuga Labs case against Ryder Ripps. And there are, so it's going to be interesting to see how the law develops in the area. For those of you who are on the call that believe code is law, the answer is no, code is not law. And if you think code is law, then, you better find a jurisdiction that doesn't, have an extradition treaty with the U.S. Because certainly the regulators don't believe code is law. And as we, saw with the Tornado Cash incident, the OFAC basically outlawed certain use of Tornado Cash, and then the developer was arrested in the Netherlands. You've got to be aware of the fact that actually law is law, and unfortunately for entrepreneurs in space, there are 180 jurisdictions, and they are certainly not coordinated on this.
Got it. And I love this analogy. You know, one of the reasons that, you know, economic design for blockchain-based distributed ledger-based systems is so interesting is because it brings together so many different kinds of economics as well. I know, Josh, you've written, you know, you've done a tremendous amount of research and writing in the space. How do you think about the economic platypus, to steal the analogy? What are the different types of economics that apply?
Well, I think actually the broad issue is perhaps something surprising. It's regarding automation. In many respects, a lot of the developments in this space have been driven by people who desire to be able to create something that can just operate independently of current legal structures or anything like that, supersede them, or in some sense, by creating them in the first place, you know, work outside of those boundaries. And as Mark's already said, that's not going to work very well necessarily. And I think we're going to get to this situation where the right mindset for developing these things is how do they work within existing legal systems? In other words, not independent of it, but how they complement it. And there we have a lot of basis of which to see the potential of. Just to give you one example, you know, many blockchains are already set up and a lot of their costs are devoted to security from, for instance, double spend attacks. What double spend attacks are in their sort of broad thing is where somebody tries to bilk one person in order to have money or assets or something to deal with another. So it's basically fraud. And if someone therefore, you know, it is true that it is difficult to perpetrate that fraud on some of the existing blockchains because they've invested a lot in security. But we should also say, well, that's kind of sad, because if this thing ever occurred, there'd be a whole lot of people, and especially if you can identify the perpetrator, would be using the legal system to enforce the fraudulent aspect of it. And so in developing these blockchains, we have to ask, do you have to have iron wall, expensive moat built around your blockchain to stave off these things, for which the deterrence of the law should be sufficient? And I think in that regard, once people start thinking of those developments and how, you know, they can be used within the existing system, I think we're going to get a lot more take up. Now, one of the problems that we face is that because of essentially the Wild West nature of the last decade or so, regulators have been sort of scarred by this. They've been scarred by, you know, potential attempts at what they call Uberization, that is, working outside the strict bounds of the regulation in order to therefore affect regulatory change. And that's been fairly unsuccessful. We saw it recently when there was an attempt to do it sort of all above the law with the Libra and then DM Association, which were trying to put forward not only a stable coin, but then a whole ecosystem built on these technologies. They went around to every possible regulator of this in the world, and eventually got told, no, we would not like to support this. And that was it. So if you tried to have a regulatory compliant thing, there was apparently no avenue in which that is worthwhile. What I would like to see is some more attempts at that, not at the necessarily the level of introducing a new supernatural currency that might cause other concerns or people don't really know how to deal with, but at some other level. You know, how will you design some of these NFTs with rights attached and have a statement of terms and conditions associated with that would be enforceable in a court in whatever jurisdiction you choose to set it up with. That would be a more interesting thing to see happen, because I think that would open up for different sets of innovations that we're yet to see.
Yeah, I totally agree with Joshua on that. I think that people need to recognize that the legal regulatory regime is going to apply Legislatures are very slow in making changes, although, the EU has announced that, their own regulations can apply to the EU. Dubai just announced regulation for virtual assets. So people are thinking about the problems imposed by that. But in the interim, we're kind of stuck with the laws that we have. And you have to operate within those laws. And, I think contract is frankly a very flexible way for people to, get the results they want in the real world without having to wait for legislature to decide something. And, there's, for example, if you want to make code law, you could do that if you choose, if you get everybody involved in the ecosystem to agree that whatever the blockchain results are, the blockchain results are. Whether people would do that, given all the rug pulls, et cetera, that we're seeing in the current environment, I don't know. But, there are ways of leveraging the existing legal system to, basically bring in these new technologies. And look, this is not the first time the laws encountered challenging issues from the new technology. When I started working in Silicon Valley around software, there was a question as to whether software is even copyrightable. It seems like a crazy question at this point because it's been copyrightable for over 35 years, but that was a question. And another question was, does Article 2 apply to it? And so we've all, Article 2 is the Uniform Commercial Code for sales. It's the thing that causes all software agreements to have that, all that capitalized terms that talk about merchantability, fitness for a particular purpose that nobody understands except, a handful of US lawyers. But the point here is that, the legal system has dealt with new technologies in the past. And, copyright in particular is very flexible. There was an attempt actually to create a new legal regime in place of copyright for software, but that ended up in failure. So I do think that the law provides a lot of tools for you in its existing state to create the economic results you want. But you do need to pay attention to that. And people who don't, are going to find out that the regulators do believe that they have authority over people. And, we went through this whole argument with the internet when it was the internet, it's not subject to law because it's global and it's virtual. And the answer is the internet may be global and virtual, but you are in meat space and the law can apply to you.
That's a good way to put it. I'd like to shift a little bit to systemic risk. So one of the great things about digital assets and the digital ledger space is that no project is an island. Many projects, for example, issue digital assets on blockchains or protocols that they don't control. Not all data is on chain. You may be using a cloud or other storage system to store data that's related to the digital assets. And these can cause a lot of problems. So we're forever hearing about not only security breaches, but economic hacks that impact one protocol and have ripples across the entire industry. So Josh, what are some of the systemic risks that can arise when you're dealing with digital assets?
Well, I think, systemic risk, that's a loaded word in of itself. Thus far, we've been kind of blessed that all of the fluctuations in value of the cryptocurrency side, or for that matter, the NFT side, have been as if they've been played on a casino island without really affecting the real world. And part of that is because, to the best of our knowledge, no one was using this value as collateral for anything outside of the digital system. So that was quite fortunate given the scale of some of these things. But of course, the entire point of all this is not that it's supposed to be some casino, but it's supposed to be something that interfaces with the real world. And I think the sort of systemic risks that we face, and I think, the last few weeks have sort of shattered how quickly things can get taken up, not in this space, but in the artificial intelligence space, Chat GPT, which is the new sort of chatbot, search engine, whatever you want to call it, thing coming from artificial intelligence, has reached 100 million users in a matter of weeks. That's fairly unprecedented. So what does that mean? Why does that hold a lesson for crypto? Well, because it's off the same internet global system. Someone somewhere could finally crack some issues to do with digital assets. And it may lead to some sort of land rush of that, far quicker than anyone could sort of understand. And in some way that could lead to people using real world assets as collateral, or interfacing with it, or coming with some legal right that does it, that suddenly creates a lot of systemic risk that's been unhinged because it's happened so quickly. I can only talk in generalities that way, but it's like we have the kindling already laid out for someone to throw a match on, and for changes to happen very quickly, simply because the internet, and it would be hard to control. So those are the sorts of risks that we face. And in other words, there are real dangers to the regulatory approach of well, let's wait and see what it throws up, and then we'll try and work out how these things fit in, because these things are hard to come up with. We've already seen the regulators struggle with the one version of this, the ICO boom, which was about a year in 2017 or so, 2016, 2017, hard to remember anymore. And then try to classify what is and what is not a security based on that, and come up with things like, oh, it's not a security if it's sufficiently decentralized, as if we could work out what that meant, or if somebody who was operating the space, even with their lawyers appended to them, could work out what that meant. So we don't sort of have those guidance and guardrails and thoughts about those sorts of things going on. And I think I think that's the biggest systemic risk we face. In other words, something could happen. There's no real regulatory response. We don't know what to do with it. And it could have real consequences. But at the moment, you can sort of say, okay, I can see that thing, but it's hard to specify what it is. We may know it when we see it, which is not great.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, if you brought up the AI comparison, I mean, AI ethics and AI regulation is very well studied, and even there, the technology is running ahead of what can be implemented. Mark, how do you think about systemic risk in this space?
Well, I think it's important whenever we talk about systemic risk to talk about it in the larger context of systemic risk for existing systems too. It's not as if our existing systems are perfect. It seems like every month we hear about a cybersecurity breach where millions, sometimes tens of millions of customers have their personal data revealed, and so as we talk about systemic risk in the blockchain ecosystem, we have to understand that it exists in our existing system. I think that there are a couple of issues which I think make the current blockchain system sort of unique. I mean, the first one is obviously they've applied technology to reduce the risk of double spend and certain types of frauds. That is really quite useful, but I also think we can't say, well, we can't use blockchain until it's 100%, certain, because the systems we're using are not 100% certain. So, once again, it's a matter of economics. How much do you want to spend to reduce the risk? The second thing I would say, and Joshua made this point very well, I'm not sure I'd call it a casino, but it's certainly on an island. And I think we're seeing from FTX the fallout, which is how all of these entities are interrelated, right? Because Three Arrows Capital went down, and you start with Luna. Luna took down Three Arrows Capital. Three Arrows Capital probably took down FTX. FTX is taking down, multiple other entities where, it's still being played out. So it is an island. Maybe it's a casino, but maybe it's, something more substantive. But as Joshua said, it has had relatively little effect on the real world. And so I think the way that the FTX scandal has, metastasized is going to make regulators even more strict on the linkage between existing systems and, digital systems. And I think the area where it's going to get the most focus is stablecoins. Tether continues to be, absolutely critical to the digital ecosystem, yet the questions about just how, what assets it has to back itself up, remains a question mark. But, I think there are initiatives going on throughout the world. Certainly in the US, and I mentioned Dubai and Europe and even the UK, and now Korea have announced laws applying to digital assets, and Article 12 of the Uniform Commercial Code is meant to deal with basically digital assets. And so I think we're seeing the law reacting, but it's going to be a while. And as I said, I think where the linkage is to the existing real world economic systems, regulators are going to be scrutinize this very, very carefully.
Yeah. I mean, and, if we think about contrasting this to your point with the economics of financial systems, we know from this year's Nobel Prize, from researchers like Chen Zishu at Stanford, that when something happens to the financial system, it has real economic impacts for decades. So it's just been very interesting to see that, while there's a lot of discussion, there's not really a lot of evidence that sort of this crypto cascade has had sort of real economic impact. But we will see. Building on the question about securities. So everybody's favorite topic, the Howey test. Are NFTs securities?
Well, I have the perfect legal answer, which is, of course, it depends. So there are certain business models in the NFT space, which I think are very likely to be securities. One would be if you basically aggregate a bunch of NFTs together and you basically sell interest in your bundle of NFTs, because in that case, it's pretty clear that the person is investing for profit, and depending on relying on the efforts of others. Just for people who don't know the Howey test, but just a little context, this test is a little bit difficult to apply since it was created in the 1940s by the Supreme Court for an orange grove. And what happened there was they sold a complete package. So if you wanted to come to Florida, you could buy a interest in the orange grove, and the company would essentially plant the trees, harvest the trees, sell the oranges, and give you the magnificent return that, of course, all operators promise to their investors. And the court found that scheme, the combination of the fact that the individuals were simply passive investors, meant that it was a security. So the key point, and this is something that people want to make sure people understand, is Howey test didn't make oranges securities, just like NFTs in and of themselves are not securities. It's the manner in which they're sold and the expectations which are raised. So I mentioned the idea of putting together a portfolio of NFTs. That sounds like a lot like a portfolio of stocks or a portfolio of other things. So that's going to be an NFT. That's going to be a security, or highly likely to be a security. Another area which the SEC is focused on is NFTs that are attached to a revenue stream. So you buy an interest in a song and you get a revenue stream from that song. That, once again, seems to tick the boxes for the Howey test, which is investment of money in a common enterprise with an expectation of profit to the efforts of others. So that is, so those are the business models of most at risk. If you've got something like, just a community like CryptoPunks, I think it's probably much less likely that is a security. But the Howey test is they say flexible, which is another way of saying very difficult to determine. So it's, as we say in the law, it's a facts and circumstances. So you need to figure out, what you're doing and how to, and you need to think about it all the time to minimize risks. And just to give you an example, one of the best known collaborative projects, Jenkins the Valet, had to delay the payment of their royalties. Jenkins the Valet basically worked with Yuga Labs to create a book. They got input from the people in their writers' room, and they agreed to pay 3,000 members of the writers' room a royalty from the book. Well, that book came out in July, and just in late January, they announced, hey, we made a couple mistakes. And so you're going to have to tell us who you are. You're going to have to go through AML and KYC. Not clear if they're doing this just from a securities law point of view. They're certainly doing it from what's called an anti-money laundering point of view, which is anti-money laundering. The best way to think of it is don't pay money to terrorists. Or people that are on our list of threats to national security, so don't pay money to Russian oligarchs, et cetera. But in any case, if that's an example where you really need to get the legal planning right. So, they delayed things 7 months. It's unclear whether there's going to be lawsuits over this, because everybody was promised royalties back in July and they didn't have to jump through all these hoops. Now they're going to have to jump through hoops. So once again, sorry, the answer is it depends. There are certain business models which I think are very likely to be subject to securities law, but there are a lot that are not. But the line is unclear, and we know that the SEC is investigating a number of projects, and even Esther Pierce, who's described as crypto mom, has reminded people at least twice, hey, securities law are very broadly defined, and simply because you're an NFT doesn't mean you're not a security. And just to be really clear, it's important to say it's not the NFT of the security, it's the project, the way the project is presented, right? So if so one of the things you should not do is have, lots of statements by the project lead saying, hey, this is a great investment, number's going to go up, this is, to the moon. That is basically red meat for regulators. So
that's a great framing. All right. So we're coming to our last couple of questions before we take Q&A. I think we've sort of addressed this, but Josh, you work with Charles River as an expert. How do you see the role of economics in legal disputes that will arise in this space?
Well, currently it's all, as Economist says, adding up to a transaction cost, because basically the disputes that have arisen thus far disputes regarding the valuation of cryptocurrencies themselves. They might have been stolen, acquired in other ways. They may have been other arrangements, depending on what you could trade those things. And so it's just a whole lot of players and working out who should be getting what. I think as we evolve in all of this, the more interesting things will come to base. The whole topic of NFTs and what they legally represent in of themselves seems to me beside the point. What is the important part is not the NFT itself, but what the venture or project or things is doing, and what are the basically contract law, the promises that are being made and the consideration that's being given for them. In those sorts of situations, we do have regulations and policies that outlaw some contracts or contractual clauses. And the role of an economist when they're called on for these things is usually to say, well, what would the entire system look like if this exclusion or restriction applied more broadly? And so, when we've been asked that for things to do with intellectual property rights before, we get asked to do that with regard to regulation of utilities. And I can see the same thing coming. But then that'll be very sector specific. It is not even clear necessarily that sort of expert witness thing would necessarily require an economist who understands deeply how blockchain consensus works or anything like that. Hopefully it becomes an ordinary way of doing things that we can sort of understand, which is, not what it's been presented with thus far. It's presented with a hype about NFTs, which is a bit odd.
So one other point that I think is important for people who are on the phone who are not following this, there could be a massive shift in how the law regulates all sorts of blockchain projects and maybe even open source projects, because Craig Wright, who is a billionaire who claims to be Satoshi Nakamoto and wrote the Bitcoin paper, has been suing developers of the Bitcoin blockchain in London, claiming that they owe him a fiduciary duty. That's the same duty that officers and directors of corporations have to their stockholders, to enable him to get back the keys to $3 billion worth of Bitcoin, which were in a wallet where he lost the keys, and he wants them to rewrite the Bitcoin code to enable him to do that. We thought that that had been put to rest by a legal decision last year, but unfortunately on Friday, the Court of Appeals in London decided to send the case to trial. So it's possible that software developers will have a fiduciary duty to the users of their ecosystem, which would have an enormous and I think negative economic effect on things blockchain, but also frankly could be applied to other types of software projects like open source projects.
Got it. All right. And final question, and we've sort of talked a little bit about this, but just to ask it. So one of the things I like to say is that, blockchain, people talk about Web3, but we're kind of in the internet of like 1993 to 1996. We're sort of in blockchain 1.0. And while we see the fallout from FTX and various other bankruptcies, we're seeing really big brand name corporations wade into the digital asset space. So not only the Starbucks loyalty program, but KKR is issuing one of their funds via Securitize. So what do you think needs to happen for the kindling to ignite, for the, for the equivalent of ChatGPT to occur?
So I think my role, I think, in this world has been waiting for the killer app. I mean, there's been one killer app, which is cryptocurrencies, but waiting for the thing that was terribly hard to do in the current environment, that all of a sudden these technologies makes better. And one of the things that I always thought that at least there was the potential for was the very fact that the blockchain technology encodes an audit trail. It's not just a database. Database is something you look at right away and you can see what's there, but you don't know the history of it. But the blockchain is a history-making entity. And so that tells us that's very useful. That means that rather than checking if something was agreed upon in the past and doing an investigative and forensic audit of it, you can query the blockchain because it has encoded that history to trace where something came from. That might be useful in all sorts of issues to do with disputes over basically contracts and also property rights. So much so that if done correctly, one could imagine that it would basically, instead of writing a court case over a dispute when the dispute arises and collecting all the evidence and so forth, the evidence is so readily there that you'd run the court case prior to transacting every single time. It's as if you flip the entire legal system into overdrive because you can now do the functions of the legal system at such low cost. And that was the thing that I've been waiting for, but it hasn't cropped up, despite the myriad of very unsafe legal environments. That is, in legal environments where people find it too costly to use the legal system relative to the economic value that's being created. I mean, if you order something on the internet from a distant country, and it comes and it's not quite what you expected, the chances are you're not going to take anything, work out what jurisdiction you are and take that to court and enforce it, which means, of course, for the most part, you're not going to do those transactions because they're unsafe. But if the blockchain or other mechanisms could provide a way of automating that, of making that costless, maybe it'll open up those avenues. Who knows? So that's what I keep waiting for. I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we're lacking the killer app like email was for the internet. But I also think that, Joshua has a very great insight there about the value of having this very transparent ledger. And I think we're seeing that, sadly, in FTX, because people can track a lot of the transactions that went on that in a non-crypto environment would have been completely opaque and might not have been discovered for years. But when the FTX or parties unknown started moving tokens or coins out of their wallets, people were on it within a day or 2 days. Where you see other financial frauds, in their traditional finance can last for decades, right? So so I think that transparency is having an effect. But I agree with Joshua, we haven't really seen somebody find the killer app for that functionality.
Excellent. All right, we have a few minutes left. We'll take some questions. We have a couple in the Q&A. There were some submitted earlier. Feel free, attendees, to submit questions. One question we have is, what role does tax law play in valuation, if any?
So the tax authorities are trying to understand what this is. There are there are simple issues like, okay, you bought your Bored Ape Yacht Club for $50,000 if you're early enough, and you sold it for $1 million. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. You have a gain there. If you held on long, it's a capital gain. However, things like sales tax and value-added tax are still a bit of a head scratchers because in many states, for example, software is taxable in California, but as a sales tax, but if you transfer it digitally, no sales tax applies. So applying the current tax regime is very challenging, I would say. And there are a number of startups that are, I think, making a lot of money trying to make that clear. So I think so taxation is certainly going to be applied to these digital assets because there's a lot of money there. How they affect the value, I don't think that people have gotten that sophisticated, frankly. My experience is that people are just doing trading without sort of thinking about the tax consequences. Although I think in 2022, at least, there's a lot of wash trading as people said, suddenly woke up and said, oh, I have all those gains from earlier in the year. Now I have to take all my assets that are, have declined in value dramatically and trade them out so I can, balance it.
All right. Another question we got through registration, and again, this comes from the audience members, so we might dispute the premise, but why do you think regulators are not taking a clear stand on digital asset regulations?
Oh, well, that's I think it's interesting. I think I think the financial side of regulation is loath to encourage innovations that they don't see where they're going to go. I think it's just straight out resistance. If they don't have to deal with these things, then great. Now it's a little odd because we see in those environments that innovations crop up around it as well. So it's like a wishful thinking type environment. But I also think there's another part to it. I think legitimately, it's hard to explain to regulators and so why you want to do something. because they're like, come back and say, well, can't you do that already? Is it really an issue? And what is the reason you want to do that? And if when you start thinking about it, so you can do drugs and illicit arms deals, it's not going to excite anyone. So I think it's like I suspect we would pry a lot from regulatory hands if we actually came up with an application that people wanted very clearly. And I think that's the and in the absence of that, we talk hypothetically, as we've done a lot during this webinar as well. We talk hypothetically, and I think they need to have something grounded. But as we saw with the Libra DM thing, coming up with a proposal for a stable coin that you don't want to be regulated as a bank, that turns out to be a head scratcher for regulators. Even if the bank you're proposing was one that would be mostly collateralized, which is amazing, because most banks they want to be as under collateralized as possible, and it's only regulation that stops it. So it's kind of like just doesn't fit. And also the regulators look at that and say, will I be destroying the world by saying no to this thing? And their answer is no, whereas there's some risk that if they say yes, it could blow up. And, you know, that's how most of these things are decided, not on the positives, but on the false positives and the false negatives and how much they care about them.
So I would say that the DM situation was an outlier in part because it was Facebook behind it, and Facebook had already generated a great deal of lack of trust, I guess, because of its actions in other areas. And then the manner in which it went around to the regulators was somewhat arrogant. And so I think a lot of the problems were of their own creation. But I also think central banks are very concerned about stablecoins as a potential replacement for fiat. How do they actually control, keep control of the economy to the extent they have control through the central banks if they have these, basically independent regimes. So I think there's a concern there. I would say, I would say that the regulators, certainly in the SEC, have been quite active, but without giving much guidance. It's called regulation by enforcement. And the problem is, it seems that every blockchain project is a security, at least according to Chairman Gensler. So that's not terribly helpful. And I will tell you, there are certainly lots of projects that are, and particularly during the ICO boom, that were very dubious, and there continue to be dubious projects. But frankly, for people, for the projects that hire people like me and my other colleagues, it's extraordinarily difficult to get the SEC to give a meaningful answer. They're basically Sphinx-like. They will go out and they'll pick on small projects, with the exception of Telegram and of Kick and a couple and the XRP. But by and large, it's extremely difficult to figure out what the rules are. And then in the U.S., at least, you have the fight between the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the SEC, over who's going to regulate the area. So Gensler has been very active, but he has been, I would say, very unhelpful in telling us what we do need to comply. And unless, of course, you say, okay, I'm gonna become a security, in which case, a lot of the value that for these projects goes away because the rules are so restrictive.
And we also, not only with the particular assets, but we see this, for example, with Cascadia Bank, Caitlin Long's bank that was denied. Yeah. So anyway, we're at time. I want to thank the audience for attending. Thank you, Mark and Joshua, for joining us. Anyone who has attended, we'll send a follow-up email. Feel free to reach out to Charles River, to Prysm Group, or to DLA Piper if you want to get in contact with us. Thank you very much, everybody.
Great.
Have a wonderful day.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.